Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews. This is our 13th Red Reviews. So with my friend Justin Clark. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. 13. It's pretty amazing. And I'll share a little factoid. There are many common sort of historical examples of why people think of 13 as an unlucky number. But the one that is the one that has the most interest to me is the one that's related to the Knights Templar. So when the Knights Templar, who were the sort of elite group of soldiers during the Crusades, when they were rounded up by the Pope and executed, they were executed on Friday the 13th in 1307. So the Friday the 13th concept comes from the execution of the Templars.
That's interesting.
In 1307, yeah. So it's kind of a little bit gruesome thing, but I think this actual episode will come out in October, so it'll work.
Sounds good, yeah. That's right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess October is like on Friday, right? Or
yeah, with our recording, today's the 28th of September. So we'll do so the Templars, they were executed on a Friday, and the 13th. So that's where that comes from.
Well, it was bad luck for them, so I guess it
was bad luck for them, right? Yeah. Although beyond their own military prowess and sort of religious convictions, the other thing that Templars were more known for was their banking system.
Okay.
They had a very elaborate banking system, a very early form of finance that kind of had an influence throughout
Interesting.
Europe, into the later Middle Ages, into the Renaissance. So, yeah, just to tie it into talking about
right.
Capitalism and all that. So tonight is, all these tend to be pretty special, but tonight's a very special episode. That's part of the reason I'm wearing my red shirt today. Is tonight we're going to be talking about the Communist Manifesto.
Cool.
And, I think even an hour of us sitting here chatting about the manifesto will not do it a justice. We'll try our best. But, the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848, at the height of the wave of revolutions that was happening in Europe in the 1840s, is easily one of the most important books in human history. And arguably, it's probably maybe next to Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the most important book of the 19th century. And probably the most important book of modern times besides Origin. And this is a book that millions, if not billions, have read, or at least to a certain extent quoted or understood.
Yeah.
It was written as a text for the emerging organization called the Communist League, which grew out of an earlier organization. And to learn a little bit more about sort of the origins of the friendship between Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and then their sort of crafting of the ideas of the manifesto and then writing the manifesto itself, I highly recommend people check out the movie The Young Karl Marx by Raoul Peck. It came out a few years ago. It's excellent. Some stuff is dramatized for effect, but the big picture, it gets quite right. And about this intellectual partnership that starts between really two important figures of modern history. They're sort of the Lenin and McCartney of, no pun intended, they're sort of the Lenin and McCartney of political philosophy. And so why does the Communist Manifesto matter? And why does it still matter today? I think it matters today because not only does it provide a lot of the main overarching themes and ideas of Marxism generally, but it also provides It provides to us a framework of tactics, things that we can use practically to enact political change. And so the version that I've read recently is in this compendium.
Oh, wow.
Called Karl Marx, The Political Writings, that was released by Verso, I think last year or the year before. This book is actually a collection of 3 books that Verso put out in succession maybe a decade and a half ago, of all of his major political writings. So this has a lot of his historical work, like the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which we can always talk about in the future, or Critique of the Grotha Program, which we'll do next year,
Cool.
The Civil War in France, and obviously the Communist Manifesto. So
Wow.
the manifesto was published in multiple languages, and so it was originally written in German, but was eventually subsequently published in French, English, and then obviously in almost any global language today.
Right, yeah.
And it has some of the most common and influential phrases that people use when they think about Marxism or left politics generally, like a specter haunting Europe. Workers have nothing to lose but their chains.
Right.
You know, workers of the world unite. We have a world to win. There's a lot of great phrasing in the book, which is in the pamphlet, which is really important. And so I recommend for listeners, if you've never actually read the manifesto, I highly encourage you to read it. It doesn't take very long. It's like 40 pages. It's very easy to read.
Yeah, I
and
think
you can always
the audio version is like super short.
Yeah, it's like an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Yeah.
But they pack a lot into that book. But I think, what we'll do is this is a text where I want to kind of go through more specifically and highlight specific passages, and then we can discuss them. Sometimes with books, we tend to do sort of big picture with the manifesto, and then the next time we'll be doing State and Revolution by Lenin. I want to go through and do specific sections of the text and kind of talk about them.
Sure.
So let's start with that, one of the most iconic phrases, because the book starts with this. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and the German police spies. And so they're setting this up, right? And remember the context in which this is written. So there are waves of protests and possible revolutions happening throughout Europe in the 1840s. This is written as essentially a party program / sort of philosophical statement by the Communist League. And they are anticipating a revolution. Sadly, that revolution never really came. But I think the specter that haunts Europe is, in my opinion, now a specter that haunts the world. And the reason it now haunts the world is because of the 20th century expansion of the notion of communism, whether it be the former Soviet Union, obviously now China, but there was a point by 1949 where a fifth of the entire world's population lived under communism. And so, I think it's important to understand that when they talk about that specter haunting Europe, it's quite important. The second thing I want to note is just the actual use of the word specter. So what does that mean? It's a ghost, basically, or a spirit. Right. So this is the sort of ghost, horror imagery is actually a through line through a lot of Marx's works. It's something that comes up in Capital Volume 1, which he writes 20 years later, or publishes about 20 years later, where he talks about how capitalists are bloodsuckers and vampire-like. Right. They keep sucking out the surplus labor. He uses these kinds of haunting imagery to get a sense of what's going on. And so I really like that what's going on with Marx and Engels in the manifesto is not just a really clear understanding of what their point of view is, but also the language is so vivid, which is quite fun to read.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of the setup. And then the first chapter is called Bourgeois and Proletarians. Now, what do these terms mean, right? So bourgeois and proletarians, you have two sides of the conflict. Today, we would basically call them the working class, which would be the proletarians, and the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois. This section starts with one of probably the most important sentences of this book and one of the most important sentences of political philosophy, period, because it sets up what Marx and Engels are articulating in something we've discussed before, which is historical materialism and how societies are shaped by material conditions and conflicts within them.
Right.
So they say, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So this is, again, what makes this section important, is when we think of society, the sort of liberal conception of history is that we are varieties of different individuals working things out within society, and that we gradually progress over time. That's the sort of traditional liberal, or what they used to call the Whig view of history.
Right.
Now, Marxism rejects that and says, actually, no, a lot of times progress happens directly as a result of these revolutionary breaks and upheavals that happen directly as a result between the contradictions inherent within the society itself.
Yeah.
And this gets back to what we talked about when we talked about Engels' Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, when we were talking about Hegel.
Right.
Where, in order for there to be an oppressor, there has to be an oppressed. Those two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And no matter how you change the relations within that given system, there will always be those two camps. They're yin and yang, and they contradict each other, and they lead to conflicts. How do we get out of those conflicts? By resolving the Constitution. By resolving the contradiction.
Right.
How do we resolve the Constitution? The contradiction. We resolve it through revolution, and those revolutionary breaks are the ways that we do that. So that's really important. And this sets up the broader discussion of historical materialism. So they go through the different eras of human societies. So they go to sort of the more prehistoric times in which things were often held in common. There were no oppressor-oppressed classes. People lived in common. Then you get into the sort of early civilizational period, whether it's the Egyptians,
right.
Sumerians, and so
Where
on.
now you have a ruling class sort of thing.
You have a ruling class because of the development of surplus value. And those surpluses are then controlled by an elite. And that elite is the owning class, or the ruling class. And so, so he talks about how, they talk about how that in earlier times, the bourgeois were in and of themselves the revolutionary subject. So if you think about the early modern period where we're getting out of feudalism and we're getting into the age of the Enlightenment, right? So all of these revolutions that happen, whether it's the United States in 1776, France in 1789, or even a century before that with the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, with the restoration of the monarchy, there's these bourgeois revolutions. They're not capitalist in the sense that these people don't necessarily own capital, but there's the beginnings of that. But the bourgeois revolutions are revolutionary in that they represent a clear and deliberate break with the past, which was feudalism. And so Marx and Engels are very influenced by Hegel's study of history, the philosophy of history, the development of stages of history, and that they evolve over time. The difference between them and Hegel is that Hegel sort of saw it as the manifestations of spirit. So it was idealism, whereas Marx and Engels are materialists. So these phases of society are determined by material production. And so in feudal society, you have limited handicrafts, small bourgeois, petty bourgeois, shopkeepers, and so on. That gets into the capitalist era of mass production and distribution that Marx and Engels would then experience and understand in the mid-19th century. So again, this kind of ties into this notion of what is the big picture, right? That society is determined by class conflicts, and that these class conflicts are the heart of political struggle and political understanding, and that without that understanding of class struggle, you really don't have a thorough understanding of political philosophy. And that's kind of the main issue with not having that, is that when you have a view of the world, like I said, the sort of liberal view where it's about sort of ideals and fighting for these sort of abstract ideals like, truth, democracy, freedom, and this, that, and the other, when they're untethered from material conditions, it kind of throws everything apart. So that's where we can kind of stop real quick. But the other thing I think that's important here to think about is the fact that Marx and Engels actually have a particularly, people think of them as just hating on capitalism, right? Which some of that's true. But the bigger component is that they talk about all of the things that are quite good about the capitalist system, and that it sort of upends some of these old feudal arrangements that have held people back.
Right.
And capitalism itself creates the conditions by which we can build a socialist world. So, for example, in the manifesto, they write, the bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. And this is where they're talking about capitalism. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expositions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all other ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new form ones become antiquated before they can ossify. And this is another really important phrase. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. So there's a lot to unpack there, but that's an important point, which is that they're talking about how capitalism has been able to create this incredible amount of wealth and production and commodities, and has in some respects improved a lot of human life, right? But at the same time, what does it also do? And this talks about the interrelationships. We're getting back into sort of dialectical thinking. When one thing happens that might be good, there's probably something that's bad, and those interact with each other, and they have to. So what's the bad thing about capitalism? It's the destruction of traditions. It's the destruction of traditional modes of existence. Of family relations start to break down, social relations start to break down, traditions, religions start to ossify and are either swept away or evolve based on the modes of production.
Yeah, they're brought into the system in a sense, right? Like
yes, and so all that solid melts in air, all that sacred profaned, and at last man faced with the consequences has to understand his lowly existence. Because in previous epochs, the understanding of being working class, the understanding of alienation within the system of life that existed pre-capitalism was very veiled. And it was veiled by different things, usually religion, right? So it was usually veiled by the sort of, well, if I toil in the field all day, then I'll get my just rewards from God or whatever, right? Well, capitalism does away with that because capitalism doesn't give a shit about the family. It doesn't care about religion. It doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care about customs and social modes. It doesn't care about any of that. Yeah. It will upend all of that in the service of constant development and revolutionizing the modes of production. So that's, I think, really important to understand about why capitalism creates so much wealth and some prosperity for some people, but at the same time, it also can bring untold misery and social upheaval.
Yeah. It's because it will incorporate what it can't and then destroy what it can't incorporate. Or it will incorporate what it can and then destroy anything else.
Yeah, pretty much. And so Marx and Engels see this as awful, obviously, but they also see it as an opportunity wherein all of these changes can be, ultimately create contradictions within the system. Mm. And so this is where you get into the discussion of the contradictions within the capitalist system itself and how over time those will come to a head. And so like when they say, like the productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. So the very conditions with which the bourgeois control society ultimately can undermine society and the bourgeois with it. This is where you get the phrase of capitalism has its own grave diggers. Right. And which I can't remember if that is actually in the manifesto or not, but at some point they say something along those lines. The other thing that's really important too is that one of the more uncharitable readings of the manifesto is that it has a more traditional sort of patriarchal view of women.
Right.
But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it may have been in Marx. I mean, Marx was more socially conservative than Engels was, but in Engels' case, Engels thought way more clearly about women and the issue of gender, in light years beyond many people writing in his day, especially men. And one of the things they note is that they say the less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All instruments of labor more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash, that he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc., right? Yeah. So this is where we're getting into the idea of wage labor. In previous epochs, people either lived on the land that they tilled, right? So like in the feudal times, in the feudal era, you would have serfs that would live on a plot of land, and you'd have the lords, and the lords would exact a specific amount of crop from them, but the rest was theirs.
Yeah.
And so people often make the argument and sort of and you'll see this within some extreme circles, that the Middle Ages was better because people worked less, which I guess is technically true, but people also died of like very preventable diseases and problems with their teeth more. So it's like, it's a wash, like, but that's a very important point, that people tend to work more under capitalism. Like that's right? Because it takes more and more and more to extract surplus value over time. One of the key hallmarks of Marxism is the decline and fall of profit over time, which is something they don't go too much in the manifesto, but it's developed more concretely in Capital by Marx. So in terms of gender roles, I think this is really important, right? So look, when they're talking about how these gender distinctions are stripped away, and with it, the fact that that these traditional relations are also stripped away. So any semblances of norms are ripped away. So if you think about what's a concrete example in our own time is the development of the two-income family. Mm-hmm. So if you look at post-World War II in the United States, especially, women became a more dominant part of the workforce. As they did, one thing that we saw as a corollary of that is that the sort of capitalist class, the bourgeois, realized that, oh, hey, if both men and women are working, we can pay the women less than the men, and then we can pay them both less overall.
Yeah. And then catch them back on the other end with mortgages
and rents and the pawnbroker, etc.
Yeah.
So instead of, this is what they're really hinting at here is something that we hear all the time, which is that capitalism and sort of traditional moral values go hand in hand. This is something you'll hear with conservatives a lot. And in reality, that's not the case at all. Capitalism is inherently anti-moral. It's like anti-family. It's anti-tradition. It's anti-morals. It's not interested in a lot of the traditional things of life that people are interested in, which is part of the reason why you see today within the conservative movement, especially people who consider themselves like the quote unquote populist right or the sort of Trump base, is that notice that when they talk about economics, they often sound like liberals or they sound like progressives where they talk about how we should have a high income tax, we should have public investments, this and that and the other. Well, they're doing that because they recognize that capitalism itself destroys tradition. It destroys moral bounds. And a lot of conservatives understood this, decades ago, and are sort of now getting this again after the sort of age of neoliberalism. So that's kind of the gist of it. So yeah, you got the bourgeoisie, you got the proletariat, and in this system they are set up for conflict, and eventually the conflict breaks, and the way it breaks is through a revolutionary break with that system, right? And Marx and Engels really did genuinely believe that was going to happen. Unfortunately, it didn't, and we're still living in an era in which revolution seems impossible. The sort of Marxist cultural critic Christopher Lash talked about the idea of, well, is revolution actually obsolete? His answer is no, but he sort of talks about the point that revolutions generally are no longer seen as the way that they're supposed to be. They're sort of seen as two ways, and that revolutions really need to matter in the sense that revolutions can't just be either changes in culture, like people call it like the women's revolution or like the LGBTQ revolution. Like, those are great. And like, I'm not trying to discount how important those are, but like revolutions within Marxism mean a very specific thing, which is the change of mode of production of society. Like, if you don't have a change of that, then you don't have a revolution in the strictest sense of the word. You
have a reform.
you have a reform, or you have a metaphorical sense of revolution.
Right.
But revolution is about changing the mode of production. And so how do we get there? And the way that we start thinking about getting there is, the big important point in chapter 2, which is proletarians and communists, which is the chapter 2. The most important point of this chapter is discussing the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. So, in this sense, the theory of communists must be summed up in a single sentence of abolition of private property. Okay. So how do we change into a society that is post-capitalist? Will we abolish private property? Now, interestingly enough, Marx and Engels both anticipate neck-bearded chuds on the internet who talk about how, well, does that mean you're going to take my shit? Or like, you're going to come in and rip the TV off my wall?
What about my toothbrush?
What about my toothbrush? So they make great pains in the book, in the Communist Manifesto, to make a point of saying that actually, that private property and personal property are two different things.
Yeah.
So personal property is like your stuff, right? It's my microphone, it's my computer, it's my book. Those are personal property. Communism is not about taking your personal shit. If anything, it's about giving you more personal shit. Like in the form of like healthcare and food and clothing and housing, right? But what it is about is it's about destroying the private property relations. So in capitalism, the mode of production is owned privately, meaning that it is owned by a small amount of people who then receive the majority of the surplus value, if not all of it, for themselves. And that is not distributed to society.
Yeah.
And so how do we change our society? We change it by abolishing the private property relation and replacing it with public property. It's replacing it with the democratic ownership of the means of production. It's about moving away from a very small amount of people owning stuff to everyone owning everything.
Yes.
So it's
my favorite part of all of it.
Yes. It's about everyone owning everything, right? Yeah. So that's the difference. And so let me see if I have a further passage. But basically they say, like, to sum this up, they say property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. That's true. Mm-hmm. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. So capital in and of itself is not set in motion by just the capitalists. It's set in motion by the workers, right? This is where you get the workers run the world, or workers make the world run, so workers should run the world, right? Yeah. This is an important point. So it says capital there is therefore not a personal, it is a social power.
Yeah.
When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. So again, summing up what we were talking about is it's the moving away of some people owning most of everything to everyone owning everything.
Yeah.
And it's ridding society of the class distinction. While equality, like the notion of inequality was important to Marx and to Marxism generally, the more important point was freedom.
Right.
And so under a society, even if you lived in a society where things were generally equal, do you have a lot of freedom? Sometimes no.
Right.
So that equality should be in the service of enhancing human freedom, which is that the ability to make sure you get the health care you need, making sure you do have clothes on your back, making sure you do have food in your belly, making sure that your kids have an education, making sure that our environment isn't going up in a ball of flames, right? And so private property is the problem, not personal property, but private property. So that's really the most important point of chapter 2.
Yeah, it's to even just extrapolate a little bit more, it's not your house, it's owning multiple houses and making a profit off of them.
Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, they have a quote by that on the next page where they say, communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with owning stuff. There's just something wrong in expropriating the surplus labor of others to appropriate stuff. That's the problem. And let's see. Oh, in this chapter, there's also their sort of party platform.
Oh,
these
nice.
are kind of interesting. A lot of these are things that have become commonplace even in the United States. But they're things that I think they're pretty revolutionary regardless. So they say, abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. That one we still haven't gotten to yet.
Not even close.
I mean, some places do, like Cuba does, but other places.
Berlin just had 200,000 homes nationalized, appropriated by the people from massive rental companies.
Right, and some societies have this in some forms. Like in the UK, there's council housing.
Right.
Which is like that.
Yeah, there's social housing in various places.
Yeah. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. That's pretty much something every industrialized society has.
Yeah.
The income tax. And this is something where right-wing libertarians will come up and say, you know who supported the progressive income tax? Karl Marx. And they'll he's like the boogeyman. But that one's important.
Socialism.
Socialism, yeah. Abolition of all right of inheritance. This is something that, we don't have in the United States because essentially in the United States what we have is called the estate tax, which has been dubbed the death tax by pollsters to make it seem bad. Even though the mass majority of people who are against the quote-unquote death tax don't know what the fuck it is and don't actually benefit from it, because most people who have to pay the estate tax are people who are truly obscenely wealthy. Like we're talking multimillionaires or billionaires, right? So confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. So let's talk about that one for a minute. So that one on the surface sounds really bad, but what that basically means is that by confiscating the property, the private property of all immigrants and rebels, what you're doing is you're making the point of we're going to avoid the problem of capital flight, so that people can move money out of a society. And also, and it's not immigrants.
No. Like
people who come to a society, it's immigrants, people who are leaving.
Yeah. And so, I think for rhetorical purposes, it's important to point out the difference between personal property and private property. And
exactly.
They're not taking the blanket from an immigrant who came to North America because of dire circumstances. They are talking about, Cuban landowners.
Yes. Right. Exactly. They who just want their slaves back.
Yeah.
centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Now, this one in most societies is sort of true. So like in the United States, we do have a centralized currency. Mm-hmm. In Europe, they do. England, Russia, centralized banking, which we talked a little bit about when we talked about Stephanie Kelton's book, right. The Deficit Myth. Check out that episode if you haven't. Also like, subscribe, and support Patreon.
And all that stuff.
And all that good stuff. But that's something like, and China does more, where they have even more banking under state control. Right. So that's something that is there. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Again, this is something that is very common in revolutionary societies, whether it be the well-known restorative agriculture of Cuba, obviously the collectivization efforts in the Soviet Union, and so forth. So that is something that has also happened. In terms of agriculture, and then in terms of factories, that's certainly the case. We talked about, I think, last time about David Harvey's book, China has what are called state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. Yugoslavia had this whole setup, and so obviously so did the Soviet Union. Equal liability to all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So this is to resolve the industrial reserve army problem. One of the things that capitalism does is it pretty much makes huge amounts of people unemployed. And so you would have national programs or, common programs that would put people back to work and help people. And the other thing too is that it talks about the equal liability to all labor. So like, it's important that people equally participate in society. Right. So like in communism, like in our future communist society, like, there are going to be days where maybe you're going to be, helping with some stuff in the office for a few hours, and then you're going to go help in a garden for a couple hours. Right. And then you're going to chill for the rest of the day, or, like it's. Yeah. Like you'll work 3 or 4 hours a day. And you'll do different tasks, different days of the week. That's right. And everything will be kind of distributed out. Whereas now everything is kind of split. Yeah. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. This is an interesting concept. Yeah. And I think part of this is going back to thinking especially about the United States at the time this book was written in the 1840s. So, a lot of people in Europe moved to the United States because the United States had all of this available land to them. Mm-hmm. We'll table the issue about why they had that available land. Right. But for all purposes of our discussion, they had this available land to them, right? Now, I've heard a completely opposite thesis by the biologist E.O. Wilson, who came up with this idea he calls half Earth, which I think we talked a little bit about when we talked about Kim Stanley Robinson's book. And in the very first episode, about the idea of if we have more and more people live in cities and we leave more and more of the countryside to nature, that it will help heal some of the problems of climate change. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the opposite solution. But it's interesting in that, the other thing too is that they're also just acknowledging that industrial urban centers are where all the capital is. So the poverty is often in the rural areas. If it's divided more evenly, then there will be less poverty in certain areas of the country and society. And then the one is the number 10 is free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc. This one has been, at least in the industrial world, largely achieved. Yeah. And the goal is to expand that, make that even more important. And the most important part of this is the end of the chapter, which is a phrase that's really important, which is that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So when people talk about how Marxism is against like individuality and he doesn't care about individuals, it's all about collectives, like that's not true. It's about a relationship between who you are as an individual and your own individuality and your own pursuits and your own talents and your own joys and your own aspirations and the overall joys and aspirations and goals of a society and how those interact with one another. And that they don't have, and in capitalism, those are often antithetical to one another. And in communism, they can be complementary to one another. Yeah. Yeah. So,
and I mean, obviously there was obviously a break at some point between Marx and the anarchists, but this is the stuff where like, this is the same thing as anarchists believe. Like, you know, like, much of this is exactly identical to anarchist writing. The freedom of every person is the freedom of all people.
Right.
You can't have, you cannot have some people who are free and some people who are not free, because then nobody is truly free.
Exactly. So there's 2 more chapters. We'll try to get through this as quickly as we can, at least the most important components. And so the next one is like about socialist and communist literature. So they talk about the different types of socialism, like reactionary socialism, like the socialism of the feudal era, and then like Christian socialism. And they have this phrase, which I figured we'll bring up because of the sort of the nature of what this podcast is,
right? Which
is that Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burnings of the aristocrat, which I think is quite good. So these sort of earlier proto-socialisms are all rooted in sort of the guilt of the wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where that comes from. Then you have petty bourgeois socialism, which is about, you have what are petty bourgeois? Like your small business owners.
Yeah.
So people who would have some progressive leanings based on their own business interests. And then you have like German or true socialism, kind of based in the literati. You have bourgeois socialism, where he critiques Proudhon, the sort of anarchist philosopher, where they say the socialist bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessary resulting therefrom. So what they're saying there is that like a lot of the sort of petty or the sort of conservative or bourgeois socialists, they want to have the sort of free development of each for the free development of all, but they're not willing to go through the revolutionary. They're not willing to equate, or they're not willing to make good with the fact that that's going to require a revolutionary break with the previous society. It's going to require a certain level of force. And I think that's kind of the difference there. They talk about utopian socialism, which we've talked about with Engels, so we'll kind of skip that a little bit. And then we'll kind of get to the last chapter, which is literally only about a page and a half, but it's really important because this is the pragmatic section of the book. But overall, the one thing they say is despite all of the issues we have with all of these different types of socialisms, the fact that they exist and the fact that people learn something from them is good. So like what they say at the end of the chapter is, but these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. So again, this is where you see more of the sort of conciliatory nature of Marxism, where we're being pragmatic. And, however you get to the notion of classless society is a good thing, but we would really like for you to be Marxists.
Right.
If you don't end up being that, that's fine. That's fine. But like, we'd really like for you to be Marxist. But if you're not, at least you're getting stuff that is radicalizing you, that is making you critical of capitalism and so on. The last chapter is the position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. This chapter is so important to understanding what's going on today. So there are numerous misreads of this part of the Communist Manifesto. Some have the more charitable reading, which is the more sort of reformist Marxism of, say, Kautsky and the Second International. And then you have like the more sort of radical break Leninist types who sort of make a point of saying that like some alliances are good, but in general, some are going to undermine your very project. Mm-hmm. But let's see what they actually say.
Okay.
So the communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. So basically, they talk about how in certain materials conditions, you're going to do different things.
Yeah.
Based on what you can do in the immediate, right?
Right.
And this goes back to something we will talk about next year when we read Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution.
Cool.
Reform or Revolution. Luxemburg is, I think, of all of the major Marxists, probably the one you're going to like the most.
Yeah, I already know some of her stuff.
Mainly just because her view, because anarchists of all of the Marxists, Rosa Luxemburg is probably the one that anarchists will like the best because she's probably the closest to you in that she sort of believes that the way in which you build working class movements is through a grand sort of, broad people-powered movement that develops into councilism and so on. Whereas the Leninist model, which I believe in, is more of a developing a revolutionary vanguard party, which helps lead the working class towards revolution.
Right.
Those are kind of the differences. And in fact, there's an essay in the Reformer Revolution book that we'll review where she kind of critiques Leninism and compares it to her own point of view. It's great reading. And I think the best way maybe to describe Lenin and Luxemburg is that they were like, maybe not frenemies. They were friendly and friends for sure and like sort of comrades, but they had very deep theoretical differences. But basically like they talk about how like in France, the communists ally themselves with the social democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie. In Switzerland, they support the radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements. In Poland, they support the party that insists on an agrarian revolution. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way. So, but they never cease for a single instant, talking about communists, to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. So I think that's really important. And then kind of finishing up this concept, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. With that in mind, there are going to be some times where you're going to make short-term alliances for sort of long-term gains, right?
Right.
So like, for example, they're calling for left unity, but in service of revolutionary ends, which I think is quite important.
Yeah.
Even if we have deep theoretical differences, which, a lot of people do, I imagine you and I both do, is that at the end of the day, when you're fighting the bourgeois itself, there's unity, there's a relevance and a power in unity and an importance in unity that matters. And so that's really, really important to kind of take away from the manifesto. Now, I think as time went on, Marx and Engels became more radical on this point, which is something we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about State and Revolution with Lenin. But I will end with one of the most influential phrases of the book, and probably one of the most influential phrases ever, which is, let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. Or workers of the world unite, if you want to kind of degender it. This is so important. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
It's the call to action.
Yeah. It's the call to action. It's the call to arms, right?
Yeah.
The world to win, which is a phrase I really quite like. Grace Blakely, who's a Marxist economist in England, her podcast is called A World to Win.
Cool.
And so, that in a nutshell is the Communist Manifesto, one of the most important books ever written. And one of the most influential pieces of political philosophy ever written. Maybe the single and most important piece of political philosophy ever written.
Yeah, potentially. That's
yeah. And so, sort of the big takeaways, understand the antagonistic class theory of history, historical materialism, understanding that historical epochs are dependent upon class struggles. They depend on class struggles. That the real goal is the abolition of private property, and the free development of each is the free development of all. And that communists will often work with others who are not quite like them in the service of fighting for revolutionary movements around the world. And then, fighting out over those details later. And
somebody just needs to remind everybody on Twitter that that's how this goes. We all have to be on the same side until this is overthrown.
Exactly. And then we can hash out those differences, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that Marx did not have, real disagreements with people. I mean, he kicked Bakunin out of the International, for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
And so, it's not that that's not the case, but the reason that I'm a Marxist and why I'm not an anarchist is because Marxism, for me at least, and maybe you can, I think we're going to do a long form discussion of anarchism when we talk about Kropotkin and critiques of Kropotkin from Marx and Engels and Lenin next year. See, we got so much good content coming through.
Yes,
I've got so much. We've got so much shit planned for you. You're not going to know what you do with it. But anyway, is that the reason that I'm a Marxist is it kind of goes back to what we talked about with Engels, is that it's laying things upon an historical and scientific foundation.
Right.
That it's providing a theoretical framework, that it's not sort of tied to these sort of loose kind of, brotherhood of man bullshit. There's something real to it,
right,
and tangible to it. And that's not to say that anarchism doesn't have that. But
that's fair.
For me at least, Marxism is if you look at working class revolution and working class movements that largely succeed, they are either explicitly Marxist or they are influenced by Marxists. So it's important that, even if you're not a Marxist, to read Marxist theory, because there's a lot in it that you will like and a lot of it that you will take away from, especially when we get to talking about Lenin and talking about the withering away of the state and those notions. I think are really apropos for anarchists. But the manifesto is very important, as we've discussed, and I'm really happy to have shared my little sort of interpretation or view of the Communist Manifesto. Every time I go back to it, because it's a kind of text that you don't want to read once. It's one that you're going to want to go to back again and again and again and sort of pick things out of and see new insights. And because you'll always find something out of it. Like any great works of political philosophy or theory, you're going to get something new out of it every time you go back to it. But the manifesto especially, and it's written in such a clear style and polemical style that's really fun to read. And then I would say, we skipped a lot about them basically shit talking other versions of socialism. So go back and read those sections to get a sense of what that is. Yeah. But they kind of do that. So that's the Communist Manifesto.
Perfect. I don't really have anything to add at this point, but I did read the Communist Manifesto a while back. I really enjoyed it. I've listened to the audiobook. It's super short. It's one of these things that, like you say, it's really informative. It can really help you get a grasp. If you're an anarchist, Marx and anarchism are like opposite sides of the same coin. Yeah. so it's important to know what's on the other side of that coin.
It's two different roads getting you to the same destination.
Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of the way that I describe it. And we don't disagree on the ends. We just kind of disagree on the means. Yeah. And we kind of disagree on the way we get there. And it's important to have those discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. So. All right. So what are we covering next time?
Next time we are covering State and Revolution by Lenin.
Nice. I'm
very excited because while we talked about how this book was probably the most influential piece of political writing in the 19th century, Lenin's State and Revolution is probably the most important piece of political writing in the 20th century. And so it is going to lay out Marxism and its theory of the state, which is something that, Marx never in his lifetime wrote a book on the state. He intended to. In his multi-volume series of Capital, he intended to develop and devote an entire volume of Capital to the state and its relationship to capital. But he never got to it. He died.
Right.
So what Lenin does is he basically reads all of this stuff for us and kind of pulls from all of these different sources. Because the way we understand how Marx and Engels view the state is by reading all of these different sources and fragments and things here and there to get a sense of where they're at, especially the critique of the Gotha program, which we'll cover next year too, which is very important. He'll come up with his theory of revolutionary change, which results in sort of the development of that vanguard party who seizes power with the workers, and then the development of a society in which you, like we discussed in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Engels, that withering away of the state, where you develop a society to a point where the state, as it's currently designed, no longer exists.
Right.
And it becomes, instead of the governance of people, it becomes the administration of things, in Engels' phrase. So yeah, we'll cover that next time. And then the next session after that will be a history of the Russian Revolution. Because State Revolution is actually an unfinished book. He wrote most of it in the spring and into the summer of 1917. And then he got a little busy, and I kind of wonder why. And
who knows?
He actually, yeah, he went partying, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, so he eventually writes a little postscript to the book where he says, it's a lot more fun to carry out a revolution than to write about one. Or something to that effect. It's not, I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically what he says.
Right.
And so he will later on more articulate the value of the revolution in other writings. But yeah, so we'll be covering a book called October, The Story of the Russian Revolution by China Mieville, which is a popular history of the Russian Revolution written by a Marxist science fiction writer. So, which is kind of cool.
Very cool.
And so we'll do that. And then we'll be doing a couple other things later on down the road. I think later this year, we're going to talk about China. We're going to read Mao. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff we're going to do next year and into the future. So I'm really excited because I want to be able to give your listeners, you know, a good thorough primer on all of the major sort of Marxist works that they can go back to as they're reading the manifesto, or they're reading State Revolution, or they're reading Mao.
Very cool.
Or Rosa Luxemburg. So that's kind of where we're going.
Awesome. So I guess the last step is, where can people find you?
Sure. So you can find me at justinclark.org. My blog's there. I haven't written up for my blog in a while, mainly just because I've been busy writing other work and just doing other things. But I do have a new article coming out in the Truth Seeker magazine about the friendship between radical American socialist Eugene V. Debs and radical atheistic political orator Robert Ingersoll. That's also available on the Indiana Historical Bureau blog if you want to read it there. And I also want tonight to discuss that we recently, within the last few weeks, we really lost a titan of free thought in the death of Dr. Tom Flynn, who worked for the Center for Inquiry. He was an absolute champion of free thought and secularism and humanism, and was an Ingersoll scholar in his own right, and was very kind to me when I started my research in Ingersoll. It was very helpful. And he sadly passed away, I think, at the age of 66. And so my condolences to him, my condolences to his family and his friends. And I dedicated my article on Debs and Ingersoll to him. So we love you. We'll miss you, Tom. And I cannot help thank him enough for his contributions to free thought.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I guess not cool, but very cool.
Yeah, thanks. And then you can follow me on social media at Justin Clark PH for Public History. And then I post book reviews there and all that kind of good stuff. And then, like I said earlier, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're getting more and more views all the time. We've gotten some lovely comments. And I'll say it for you again, become a patron. Cory does an incredible amount of work on the show, and it's not easy. And the man's got to eat, and his kids got to eat. Okay,
yeah, that's right.
He's got to feed his kids, man. I'm gonna pull their heartstrings.
That's right.
But
don't you want my kids to eat?
Exactly right. We're getting into wintertime here. It's gonna get cold, right?
That's right.
You're gonna have heating bills. But he works really, really hard, and he's creating really interesting content, not just my show, to blow smoke up my own ass, but to talk about the other really great work that he's doing. So definitely follow him on Patreon. I think, is it just Mind of a Skeptical Leftist on Patreon, or is it your name?
It's patreon.com/skepticalleftist.
All righty. Great. And so, yeah, definitely become a Patreon supporter. And if you can't do that, then definitely share our stuff out.
Yeah.
Hit that like, hit the subscribe, share it out on Facebook, share it on social media.
I'm confident that if you like this, then somebody will like this. So
yeah, absolutely. And I promise you that this is not a multi-level marketing scheme.
That's right.
My friend and comrade Cambria, she always says that there are only two types of MLMs that we like. Men loving men and Marxist-Leninist Maoists. We don't like multi-level marketing.
That's right.
That's a long-winded outro, but basically, support the show. I think Cory's doing really interesting stuff, and I can't thank him enough for providing this wonderful platform for me to do something I really love, which is to share the history of ideas with people.
Well, and I really appreciate your perspective and the amount of reading that you do for this show, because I can't do that much reading. So
yeah. Well, and it's going to be a lot of fun. The rest of the year is going to be really exciting. We're going to do Lenin. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. And then after that, we're going to take a little break and we're going to do a couple smaller books. We're going to do this book, Stolen, by Grace Blakely, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
This is going to be a really great book as a companion to our episode about David Harvey and neoliberalism. Because this book kind of picks up where that book leaves off in terms of the sort of neoliberal hellscape that we live in. And then the other book we're going to do, before we get to Mao, is this book that I've been reading like furiously, and I've been like procrastinating on reading stuff for the actual show, but I guess this is going to be for the show too, is a book called The Minimal Self by Christopher Lash. Christopher Lash is best known for his book, The Culture of Narcissism, which has been really big over the last few years because of Trump, but people really don't understand what Lash is trying to get at. Christopher Lash is somebody who is painted as being like a neoconservative, but that's not true at all. He was a socialist and a Marxist.
Okay.
But he had a very unique perspective on where we're at in the moment. And I think when we were doing maybe one of our post games or whatever, we talked about how doesn't it feel like our society isn't changing at all? Like everything feels like we're just kind of repeating and cycling out, and everything feels so tenuous. He talks about that in a book from 1984. So like he kind of pegs a lot of what's still going on in our society in this book. There's just so much stuff that I'm excited to do.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's going to be really, really fun. Oh, and one other thing, if you don't mind, is for folks who are interested, I am involved with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or Marxist-Leninist tendency here in the States and around the world. And if you're interested in learning more about the PSL, we do a lot of really great stuff in terms of protests, political action, and political education. So you can check us out at pslweb.org.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you, Cory. I really appreciate it.
All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. I want to say thank you again to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work as many gig hours. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then you can check out the show notes or check my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people. From Many People's Strength, which is a show about Saskatchewan politics. And a new project I'm involved in that's called the Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries with my friend Damien Marie at Hope. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request, which is facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which you can find on my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's just all try to be kind to other leftists and to all people, and even if we think they're wrong. The battle that we are fighting is an uphill one and has many obstacles, and we will need all the comrades we can get.